In 1922, in the quiet Bavarian countryside of Germany, Andreas Gruber began noticing strange things happening around his family's farm, Hinterkaifeck. Footsteps would appear in the snow, leading to his farmhouse, yet there were never any tracks leaving. He would hear muffled sounds in the night, creaking floorboards, faint knocks, shuffling in the attic. Growing unsettled, Andreas inspected the house and even asked neighbors if they'd seen anyone. But each time he searched, he found nothing and no one. One evening, Andreas found an unfamiliar newspaper inside his home. No one in the family had bought it, and none of his neighbors recognized it. Then, the farmhouse keys vanished. The family became unnerved, and Andreas began speaking of the farm being haunted, though he was quick to brush the idea aside. 1 week later, on a cold March night, Andreas, his wife, daughter, and grandchildren were attacked and killed. A neighbor found their bodies stacked neatly in the barn, each member of the family showing signs of severe blunt force trauma. Their maid, who had recently taken a position at the farm, was found inside the house, also bludgeoned. When the authorities investigated, they found evidence that the intruder had been living secretly in the attic for days or even weeks before the murders. Straw bedding, remnants of food, and signs of recent activity were scattered throughout the attic, suggesting the family had been unknowingly hosting their own killer. But what's even more chilling is that after the murders, neighbors reported seeing smoke rising from the farmhouse chimney. The killer had apparently stayed in the house, eating the family's food, living there alone for several days before leaving undetected. Despite a thorough investigation, no clear motive or suspect was ever identified. The case remains one of Germany's oldest unsolved murder mysteries, with the silent intruder of Hinterkaifeck Farm never found or seen again. Story 2. The Oklahoma Girl Scout Murders. On June 12, 1977, at Camp Scott in Locust Grove, Oklahoma, 3 young Girl Scouts, Lori Farmer, Michelle Guse, and Doris Milner, settled into their tent for their first night at camp. The girls, aged 8 to 10, were thrilled for the week ahead, packed with activities and games. But as darkness fell and the camp settled down, a terrifying chain of events unfolded. In the middle of the night, counselors reported strange sounds near Tent Darrate, where Lori, Michelle, and Doris were sleeping. Some campers mentioned hearing low, unfamiliar noises outside their tents, and one counselor thought she'd heard a distant scream but couldn't identify where it was coming from. The unsettling sounds, however, were brushed off, and the camp returned to silence. By the following morning, tragedy had struck. A counselor, making her rounds, found the bodies of the 3 girls. They had been brutally assaulted and murdered. Shocked, camp staff alerted authorities, who launched a massive investigation into the horrific crime. What police found was disturbing: a flashlight, duct tape, and evidence that the attacker had entered Tent Darrate without anyone noticing. But the trail went cold almost immediately. A local convict named Jean Leroy Hart, who had recently escaped prison and was familiar with the area, became the prime suspect. Despite a massive manhunt, he eluded capture for months. Eventually, he was caught and put on trial, but he was acquitted due to lack of concrete evidence. Hart's acquittal didn't bring peace. Locals remained convinced he was the perpetrator, but without a confession or physical proof, the case went cold. The murders of Lori, Michelle, and Doris have haunted Oklahoma for decades. The case remains technically unsolved, with no one ever officially held accountable for the tragic deaths of the 3 young Girl Scouts. Camp Scott shut down permanently, leaving the community with lingering fears and unanswered questions. Story 3. The mysterious death of Kendrick Johnson. In January 2013, Kendrick Johnson, a 17-year-old high school student in Valdosta, Georgia, was reported missing after failing to return home from school. The next day, his body was discovered inside the gym, rolled up in a large wrestling mat. At first glance, investigators ruled the death an accident, suggesting Kendrick had fallen into the mat while reaching for a shoe and had suffocated after becoming trapped. But from the start, things didn't add up. Kendrick's family wasn't convinced by the explanation. After examining his body, they noticed bruises and other injuries that didn't fit the story. They requested an independent autopsy, which revealed signs of blunt force trauma inconsistent with accidental suffocation. Surveillance footage from the school, which should have shown Kendrick's last movements, was mysteriously missing key segments. Additional security footage that was available was blurry and didn't offer a clear view. The case took an even stranger turn when investigators found that upon Kendrick's body being returned from the first autopsy, many of his internal organs were missing, replaced with newspaper stuffing. A deeply unusual practice. The family demanded answers, and their suspicion grew that there was a cover-up involved, possibly to protect other students or individuals connected to the school. Despite these findings and mounting public pressure, officials have repeatedly upheld their initial ruling that Kendrick's death was a tragic accident. Multiple investigations were launched over the years, but none led to a different conclusion. Kendrick's family continues to seek justice, but to this day, the full truth behind what happened remains elusive. His death, surrounded by irregularities, missing footage, and unanswered questions, has left many wondering if there's more to the story than what's been officially told.